Hi, welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. My name is Vanessa, and this is Literally Literary, which is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP.
It's good to jump back in with Hate You Give after a workshop and screening the film and getting some thoughts on the film and the novel and from students too.
Yeah, some interesting questions that day.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about today for this episode. Now that we're going to dive straight to the text. And Vanessa, did you want to get us started with the opening scene of the party and why you think that's important?
So on the very first page, some of the first lines are, I shouldn't have come to this party. I'm not even sure I belong at this party. And I feel like that kind of introduces us to Star really quickly because she's questioning why she's somewhere where she should feel comfortable being. And it kind of shows us that she's battling with these two identities that she's having.
Which identities would those be, would you say?
Like her, I guess, at home in her neighborhood in Garden Heights, that identity versus, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Versus her personality at Williamson, where she has to act a different way and kind of censor herself. Yeah,
and some of that we touched on lately in the first episode. But here it's this very first scene where that lack of belonging is ironic, right? Because it is her neighborhood, and yet there's not just the reputation that she has as kind of someone who's going into this rich white prep school, but also the cultural markers that we've talked about with Poet X about. In this case, like the sneakers become very important, hoodies, things like that, that you associate, and ways that she's othered, right? And othered here means that anytime that you're different from someone because of your race, religion, or in this case, like what you're wearing, it's just a way to get singled out and made to feel inferior from everyone else. How do you think she handles that? Like, do you think she feels even worse because of it? Or do you think like she stands up for herself? Or
I think initially she doesn't stand up for herself. But the more she sees that this is something she has to fight for, like to be seen as equal or to not have to have these two different identities, she starts to fight for herself and for Khalil.
Yeah, and so this is the one scene where we do get Khalil. So spoiler to everyone, but you really do in the film. You really do see their chemistry, and so too in the book. Of course, in the book you get a lot more backstory, but. They kind of reminisce, right? There's a lot of reminiscing about the way things were, references to like what they would do, and all of this is interrupted by this just scuffle that becomes a shooting, and so this is where we get. What I call the incident. And so if we can...
Can I interrupt real quick?
No, go ahead.
I think it's important to also notice that the thing that stops the party is a shooting also.
Mm-hmm.
And then is when the police incident happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you make of that? Like, what does that say about the community or the party itself or... Star feeling like she doesn't feel like she should be there?
Well, I think it's important to show like the neighborhood that they're in because it introduces like the audience to the idea that there are gangs in this neighborhood. and which is why the shooting happens.
Yeah, and so there's two gangs, right? The King Lords and then the Garden Disciples, and so they're the Crips to the Bloods essentially. Yeah, that's a very good point about it's she's there just to obviously have fun and relax, and all of a sudden everything stops, right? And so they have to rush out. She happens to be with Khalil. That's important to note. They didn't really plan on both being together like that, but when that happens, you have to go with whoever you're with. And so he offers to take her back home. In the movie, this is also something that, of course, is not glossed over because, well, we'll get more into the movie in the last episode, but just wanted to note that the movie does go into this. But as I said in my presentation on Wednesday, that the way the movie represents the shooting itself is subtly but yet significantly different from the way it's represented in the book. So I'll talk about those differences. We can talk about those in the last episode. But going into the scene itself, so this is on page 100 is where we get the climactic scene of the incident. So he gets pulled over after he had stopped, and at first, of course, he's wondering, well, I think all of us have maybe wondered this in the past, like, why did I get pulled over? And there's a lot of potential reasons to answer that and explain that question. Some of which, though, are laden with, racial profiling, right? And especially because, as you mentioned, Vanessa, that they had just witnessed a shooting, there's that as well, right? That, like, are they fleeing the scene because, like, they were the culprit or something? So a couple passages that I highlighted from here as strong lines is first on 21, the way that Star has that experience, well, not experience, but just, the foreknowledge of how do you handle a situation like this. And I think that's very important for black kids, and because, as we all know from what we've seen in the news, that even black kids are getting shot. And so I think, the younger you start with them as educators and parents, the better off they'll be for the time being until there's, serious reform. But she says here, I remember something else Daddy said. If you're with somebody, you better hope they don't have nothing on them, or both of y'all going down. Right? So just one of the many lessons that Maverick, his dad, Mav, instilled in her. Yeah. And so, the cop, of course, pulls up to him, asks for the usual license, registration, and insurance. And then she notes that he broke a rule by not doing what he wants, by asking why he was pulled over. But I'm no legal expert, but I think that's a reasonable question, to ask. I think actually they're supposed to tell you why they pulled you over. And so the one thing to think about this scene is, like, the degree of how much is it that Khalil cooperates versus how much is it that the officer 115 escalates the situation well, maybe not unbeknownst, but needlessly, I should say. And then on the next page, on 22, so he's got the flashlight, they both have their hands on the dashboard. He's asking, still wants to know why he got pulled over. The officer says, your taillight's broken, which I don't know about you all, but that just seems like a pretext, of course. I mean, how many cops pull over people for that? And then, Khalil asks, well, you're going to give me a ticket or what? You know what? Get out of the car, smart guy. And so that's where it escalates. That's kind of, to me, the point where you can think about what could have the officer done different, right, to address that kind of situation. And so it gets even worse, of course, because he says, Star here. Khalil gets out with his hands up. 115 yanks him by his arm and pins him against the back door, right? So there's that kind of aggressiveness from the part of 115. And then on the next page, 115 pats him down 2 more times. He turns up empty, right? So he's already been frisked 3 times. And I think there's something to be said about, well, yeah, I guess you would maybe search for them like as part of procedure, but like 3 times, to do that for a kid, right? We're not talking about an adult here. And then of course, Khalil ends up moving, even though he was instructed not to move, as his officer runs his license. And Star knows as well. They told me it's not smart to move while a cop has his back to you. And, so he opens the driver's door, Khalil does, and he says, "You okay, Star?" And then pow, the first shot, and there's 2 more that follow. And Khalil, of course, is mortally wounded here. And there's a flashback to Star being 10, because this is exactly what happened with, well, not exactly, but similar to what Natasha, her friend, another one who was just killed innocently. And of course, she breaks kind of one of her own rules, because I don't know if you guys noticed, but she's supposed to stay in the car, but she jumps out of the Impala and rushes around to the other side, right? And I think that's just, of course, it's her best friend, right? A former best friend, and you care about him, and who cares if you're not supposed to do that? But it's obviously the scene that gets everything started. But I will say that there's a lot to say about what the police departments are doing to prevent these kinds of things from happening. Everything from revising the use of force policy to giving a verbal warning before you're gonna shoot, right? So that at least if you are gonna shoot, and it's like in this case a hairbrush that he was ultimately gonna reach for, then they know, better comply, right? If he's gonna shoot, there of course there's other things like dash cams, body cams. There's been issues with that, even because sometimes they'll turn it on only when they already did something wrong.
There've already been instances where it's been found that officers turn off their body cams, plant evidence, and then turn it back on.
Yeah.
That's why I think as civilians, it's also important to know your rights, and then that you can film, in light of all these shootings. One of the things that you see, unfortunately, being developed are apps that, as soon as you're done recording it, send it out. Then they're meant intentionally to record police, because sometimes they can intimidate you from not recording.
Yeah, that's a good point.
This happened.
The ACLU has an app for that where it will automatically be uploaded, and that's important because sometimes your possessions are confiscated. And of course, in this case, video evidence becomes very important, as in, of course, a lot of shootings, right? Because without it, she's the only witness. And I wanted to give a reference to the useofforceproject.org that I found a lot of great information about the way that a lot of activists are suggesting we reform the criminal justice system, at least with what police departments can. And so cities like San Francisco are kind of leading that charge in how progressive they are, whereas places like Reno, Nevada are on the opposite side of the spectrum and kind of going backward as far as how it is that we protect those innocent, instead of just presuming guiltiness just because of a certain race or because maybe they're in a bad mood or whatever. Or in this case, of course, Khalil was just checking on Star. So if it wasn't for Star, you would wonder how that would have been different, right? Because he. It's a tragedy that he died just checking on someone he really cared about. You know, I don't know. What do you guys think about the whole incident?
I think it's these incidents do happen quite often, and to me, as an outside observer, I've never really been pulled over like that before, but I can relate in a way. Being pulled over at immigration checkpoints, is my kind of like racial profiling in a way, or just kind of, like, really, this is happening every time I drive by myself through a border checkpoint. They have me pull over to the side and
really
bring out the dogs, and I can understand kind of like the rage of like, or just of like, just come on, get over with, or like, I've felt like an animal before, like bunch of officers standing around, they bring out the dogs and sniff around. Whereas maybe in the past where I've been traveling with friends, it's, oh yeah, go through, I always thought that was strange. So relating that experience, I can definitely see how someone can be annoyed or some of that rage, because it is a very tense situation, especially if you're aware of, what's happening. The use of force, and if you're not in control, I think that's something that people just will react to instinctively too, is not thinking first. And I think just observing all these cases and the way people talk about it online, it's unfortunate, because I think some people do not put themselves in those other people's shoes, and oftentimes come from a place of privilege. I know that's a word that people when they hear it, get weirded out about, because they don't want to recognize their own privilege or think that means something, like some magic. It's not, but the fact that it doesn't affect you the way it does others says a lot. The way you might be scared getting pulled over, and my point is, seeing people comment online like, well, if they just followed directions, this wouldn't have happened, and it's a lot more complicated than that, and I don't think they've ever had to deal with a checkpoint where maybe an officer is being overly aggressive, or maybe taking out something on you. So it's these situations are incredibly difficult to pull through, but I mean, it's something that keeps happening. So I do like that cities like San Francisco are taking measures to change the way these interactions are happening, because that's obviously what we need to start looking at.
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole thing about shooting first, asking questions later, that is referenced. Vanessa, what did you think about the scene, the way it played out in the novel?
Okay, so I think it's interesting because Star mentions on that beginning of that first that first sentence of that chapter 2. She says, "When I was 12, my parents had 2 talks with me." And then she mentions that the first one was the usual typical birds and the bees. And then the other one was to what to do if a cop stops her. And I think I've seen this in like a couple of other things, like this talk that parents have with their kids, but about stuff like this.
Like what?
Well, like one of my favorite shows, Blackish, they talked about it as well, about this talk that you have to have with your kids, as this is who you're going to be seen as, and this is how you have to react. But I thought it was interesting that Khalil didn't also have that same talk, and he responded in a different way than she did.
And it's gender too, right? I think even though they're both black, I think because he's the man, not just because he's the driver, but because he's the boy, I should say, not man. Sorry. Right. I think there's a certain presumption of like, well, he must be in a gang, right? Versus like girls, there isn't that as much, even though, again, they're both black. Have you had any experiences like that, Vanessa? Like with authority, with whether it's police or anything like that?
No, I haven't actually.
Well, that's good. And I, nevertheless, though, I think, what he says about that is very unfortunate, right? Like, we shouldn't have to have, of course, that talk, but that's just the way it is. But it reminds me of the Ta-Nehisi Coates, his book, Between the World and Me. It's a letter to his son about, this is the way the world is. This is what you need to know to be ready in this world as a black boy who's going to become a black man. And it's one of my favorite books, very much modeled after James Baldwin, in terms of the way he viewed society and black relations in the U.S. So I really recommend that. And it reminds me a lot of this, the way that Mav is so progressive and anticipatory of what she needs to know, what, even if it never happens, right? And even if she's innocent, this is just something you have to know. And I think that goes back to this is Garden Heights, right? This is the rose that grows from concrete, which is named after which is the name of Tupac's poem. And it's funny because this is what Khalil was listening to, right? It says right here, he cusses under his breath, turns Tupac down. So there's almost symbolically the idea that Tupac has been drowned out, right? And of course, Tupac, as we all know, was killed. And so it's kind of this idea that, your one voice, your one, defender and, someone who stood for black justice and, is no longer in the frequency, right? This is a different territory now, even though it's still Garden Heights. But yeah, so that was, that's of course what gets everything started, the inciting incident. But so what else after this did you want to talk about? And as you're looking for it, there's a lot of trauma in this one, right? Obviously, because it's not the first time, as we had said, that Star has been bear witness to something like this. And so it's the flashbacks, but also of losing your best friend at this age in this encounter, and being put on the spotlight as well.
Okay, I found it. It's actually on page 71 in chapter 5. So this goes back to her whole identity and her battle between the two that she has. So it's her first day back after losing Khalil, and it says, I just have to be normal Star at normal Williamson and have a normal day. That means flipping the switch in my brain so I'm Williamson Star. And so she has all of these rules for herself of who she needs to be when she's at Williamson with all of these white students.
Like what?
She doesn't use slang.
Because she doesn't want to be seen as a certain way, right?
Right. And one of the things that it says is, when she's talking about using slang, she says, slang makes them cool, slang makes her hood.
That double standard. Also the talking back, that she doesn't want to be seen as the angry black girl. Again, this idea of anger as racial. She's definitely able to do this, right? She's quite skilled at being able to balance these two worlds. I forget it's kind of like code switching, right, Richie? the way what she's doing here, not just in the literal language, the lack of slang, but also the behavior, right? And it almost seems like, she's a chameleon. And Why else, Vanessa, do you think this is important when it comes to her development as a character?
I just think that it's important because she also uses references to other things to show this is who I am when I'm this over here, and this is who I am when I'm over here. But one of the things that she kind of uses as the middle ground is the Fresh Prince. So she compares herself to Will a lot throughout the novel.
And which is in the book, but we'll talk about that later. How is she like? And so those of you who don't know, because you might be too young, but Fresh Prince was this awesome, comedy sitcom, right? And the 90s, and the great Will Smith kind of broke out from there. Well, I mean, I would say that's his breakout show, and is about this black teenager who goes from the hood to a prep school, which is like Star. And amongst the comedy, though, there are some of those moments where you see the tension between his view, the way he sees things, and the way his preppy, uncle and freaking his name.
Cousin. Carlton?
Yeah, his cousin. Yeah, Carlton. I mean, it becomes very funny, right? But I mean, under it, of course.
Right, the contrast is played off for comedic effect, but
Yeah.
in this case, right, we're seeing how it can really affect someone's identity.
Yeah. And why do you think Fresh Prince in particular is so prominent beyond the Williamson Prep and the Garden Heights for Star? Like, do you think there's a symbolism there?
I think she is trying to see herself as him, and she also knows that in a way becoming Williamson's Star is censoring herself, but she also sees the Fresh Prince, and then she sees that Will doesn't censor himself and that he is still finding ways to be himself even though he's not in that same environment that he used to be.
Yeah, exactly. She mentions here at the bottom of 71 that even though Will wore his uniform jacket inside out, she can't do that, but she can, wear the sneakers and the backpack that matches, right? And so sneakers are another powerful symbol. Was there another pop culture reference there?
No.
With the sneakers?
Well, her favorite sneakers are Jordans, so she has like a ton. I can't remember how many. I don't remember if she says. I think she says in the movie. I think, yeah, but she has like all of the really important ones. Like I think her favorite ones are the Space Jam 11s. But yeah, she has so many that she even gets new backpacks for the different shoes.
Yeah, and it's her way, as she mentions there, of not being singled out, because you're pretty much the only black girl in that school, but at the same time still keeping some part of that identity of yours, right, that you don't want to let go of. Mm-hmm. Because I think, it's kind of similar to the border here in terms of Mexican American culture, Richie, and like assimilation. I mean, of course, we can go on all day about that, but basically the idea that once you immigrate into the U.S., that you start immersing yourself in the American culture, American music, and you sometimes forget about your heritage and your roots.
Almost to the point of like being opposite. Like there's a local comedian who had a bit for a long while about how sometimes it's these immigrants who end up being more American than Americans in the sense that they become more patriotic and join the border patrol and almost in a way to like prove themselves, quote unquote, prove themselves.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that. So I think it says a lot about Star and her maturity, despite her age, to be able to kind of not sell out, right? Because I think it would be very easy for her to do so because she hangs around people like Haley who, would definitely be in favor of that. Vanessa, did you want to stay on the pop culture references that we see there and throughout the novel? Like, were there other ones that you found interesting and important?
I think Tumblr is one of the ones that's really important. Because in that same chapter of chapter 5, on page 76, she's with her best friends Maya and Haley at Williamson, and they're talking about like the past and how they were like obsessed with the Jonas Brothers, and they had like Maya's screen name was Maya Jonas, so there's that aspect of it, but then we come back to the present and we see Stars now using her Tumblr to post activist posts, like Emmett Till, and posts about Khalil, I believe, later on.
And just for some context, Irvin, just to add to what you're saying, so Emmett Till is described as a 14-year-old black boy by Star here, the narrator, who was murdered for whistling at a white woman in 1955. His mutilated body didn't look human. And with Haley, right, there is that conflict between friends that ultimately ends in a way that is very satisfactory. But yet you see kind of the cost of that activism that you're mentioning, right? Mm-hmm. That Tumblr is supposed to be, well, not supposed, but like in general, it's, well, I don't know what, from what you guys were saying, it seems like a friendly environment. You follow friends, but then I guess just like other social media, they can unfollow you if you like offend them or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of represents that divide that is beginning to grow between her and Haley. And in many ways, they are foils of each other because of their beliefs, even though they go to the same school, even though they're still friends to some degree here. There's this tension brewing, right? Like a coffee pot, where, I mean, like a pot of water, where, Haley's beliefs are clearly, she's realizing that Haley isn't much of a friend, right? That these days, unfollowing, I think, is a big deal. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you guys, the way I've kind of conceive of it, because like, especially family, mm-hmm. Like if your cousin or someone like blocks you even, mm-hmm. that says a lot, even though you still see them like in Christmas time or the holidays or whatever it is.
Parallel, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have our social lives and our online lives, and oftentimes we intertwine them so much, and our online identities become such a big part of, I think, a lot of how we perceive our real lives, mm-hmm. right? But I like that you mentioned the fact with like family, with the way political issues have been piling up, lately. I think we've seen a lot more discourse and we've seen a lot more divide, mm-hmm. a lot more fighting. On a variety of topics, right? One including, of course, race, mm-hmm. discrimination, and so yeah. I mean, just the act of being blocked or unfollowed can kind of have that effect on someone, and especially at this age where they're still developing and figuring out their lives. It can be a big thing.
Yeah, and I think. It ultimately, there's a cost to that, right? Like, not just by closing off herself from Haley that, she begins at this point, but she starts noticing things about Haley, right, that are what we call microaggressions, which I just like to call better like death by a thousand cuts. These forms of racism that are not blatantly racist, but we still see. And I just briefly wanted to make a connection to Black Klansmen, because it reminds me of some of those things that we talked about in that one about race, and how now in the modern day, which is, hey, you give us a say in the modern day, unlike Black Klansmen, it's even worse than hoodies, right? Because we get the tiki torches incident. People who no longer need that cover and
get defended by the president.
So as very
both sides.
Both sides, and quote unquote very fine people.
Says,
So kind of going off that, right? That like it seems like it's endorsed and therefore not seen as something that would be as problematic in the day as it would be in the days of Black Klansmen, even though, of course, back then it was more acceptable. But I think there was, of course, that civil rights movement that emerged from it.
No, that. You're referencing that now. The whole March of Tiki Torches, that was connected to Ferguson, right? As well, after the Michael Brown protests, which in the book, right, you see protests pop up, this kind of civil unrest, which very much reminds me of what happens in Ferguson, right? And kind of like the outset of the Black Lives Matter movement, or as Starr says here, right, his life mattered, right? He died, but he lived, and his life mattered. That's kind of like the big sentiment there at the end of the book.
Yeah.
But I've been seeing this rhetoric, speaking like the hate you give, the hate we give. I've noticed that when people try and call out, the whole alt-right, this kind of new rise, fashion, like the people calling them out are the ones being called hateful. I don't know if you've observed that.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Why are you adding to the hate and and just kind of repeating this cycle of not creating any kind of meaningful dialogue or answers, but more so kind of a frustration.
Yeah, and it's a diversion tactic in part, and that kind of leads into my next one, which is right on 100. This is still on Khalil. Khalil, like I said, we don't get too much of him, but we do get a lot of him after the fact. And on 100, so this is the interview by Detective Gomez, and Star's mom is there as well. And the attitude, I think, that you get from the detective is notable. She seems incredulous that he was patted down 3 times on page 100. And Star, is kind of, you feel like you got to cheer her on, because like she's still a girl, and yet she's so self-assured of what she saw, how many times she saw it, and why that matters. Why his black life matters. And then she says notably here, the detective says, and this kind of goes to the victim blaming, but Khalil didn't stay put, did he? She says, and Star responds, he didn't pull the trigger on himself either. And it's like one of those drop the mic moments to me, because a lot of times with the Black Lives Matters, the victims, that are now of a growing list that we get at the end of the book, and of course many more before them and from our time, before our time, that's what ends up happening, that, he was carrying Skittles, right? Or he was wearing a hoodie, or he had a water gun.
Tamir Rice, right?
Yeah, I think so.
That was even 5 years ago to this November.
Yeah.
It happened in November.
Yeah.
He was 12 years old.
Yeah.
Playing with a little gun, toy gun.
Yeah, and just real briefly, just to continue the preliminary interview, that first of all, I mean, we have to give props to Star. She's just a kid. she's still obviously grieving, she's still traumatized, and yet has this courage to actually answer questions, and not with no attorney present. And so Detective Gomez pushes on and says, well, did you know that Khalil sold narcotics? And so she's taken by that, she's very much flabbergasted. And the conversation continues. And, the detective really pushes this point, that saying, incriminating Khalil basically by saying, do you know if he was involved with the King Lords and in the Garden Disciples, and then did he consume alcohol, right? And so all these questions is kind of to provide some kind of cover, basically, for Officer 115. And it ends with her mom saying, are y'all putting Khalil and Sar on trial, or the cop who killed them?
That's right.
I think it's a very important question to ask ourselves, that Angie Thomas, rightfully places there for us to think about, in terms of the many cases like this one, where you really do wonder. I mean, it's not a rhetorical question. I think it's a question that we need to ask ourselves.
Yeah. Even within the system, like speaking of trials, there's the trial of the public, public thought, public opinion, and that always happens whenever there's violence. People already start putting the victim on trial and like trying to blame them for what happened.
That in this case, they were part of the gang, or that they had previous altercations or something like that. They start looking at their record and just kind of scrutinizing that without actually thinking about, well, this was an isolated incident, right? Yeah. That in this
Whereas
case,
it should be 115 being at the scrutiny.
Yeah. Very good point.
And I think something we talked about on Wednesday at the presentation Public I/O is it's important that Star even got his badge number, because I think most people don't know that it's important to. You can get their names. You can ask them for their names and their badge number. They're supposed to give it to you. I think in a lot of situations people might not think of that, but again, with her training, she was able to get that, because that could also be something that if she didn't get it, he could have gotten away. Well, I mean, he still does, but
yeah, I mean, she's well equipped, but unfortunately, things just don't go well. Vanessa, what was another passage that you found important?
I can't remember if we talked about the comparison of Harry Potter to gangs.
A little bit. We touched on it briefly.
Okay.
No.
I wanted to talk about that then.
What page?
It's chapter 10, page 166.
Okay.
So one of Star's favorite movies or novel series is Harry Potter. And so to make her feel better, her dad offers to watch Harry Potter with her. And then they both tell him no, because when he watches Harry Potter, it's all about gang theory. And he gives these really good examples of how Harry Potter is gang theory. Like the Hogwarts houses are gangs. They each have their own colors. They have their own hideouts. And they're like ride or die for each other.
Yeah, yeah. Voldemort too.
Voldemort too, yes.
Because he who must not be named, right? Like the big capo. And it's kind of interesting how his dad conceives of these things, like the way that he conceives of pop culture, I find very interesting. And, it's his perspective that he brings to things, right? That kind of makes you see it in a new light that I think is worthwhile. It also shows his willingness to kind of connect with her, right? Because he clearly sees it as a white product, and so even then, he's still kind of willing to, allow it. And that's important also in terms of their relationship, because of her boyfriend, Chris, who's also white. Because, Mav is very proudly black, and I think also very, very much in tune with how he is raising his daughter, right? We already talked about this at length, but just another way of how, you know, the people he hangs out with, his partner, in this case, like what she ends up liking. So yeah, I think it's definitely one of those important connections that it lightens the mood a little bit, you know, but you kind of see them, you know, bond a little more. I mean, and frankly, it's also just pretty funny, you know, because it brings down Harry Potter, this, you know, bougie, fancy magic show with like essentially its own prep school, right? That just becomes a story about gangs, right? And so it's kind of that whole high culture, low culture divide that his dad manages to bridge quite effectively. Did you yourself like see that? Like, are you a Harry Potter fan who feels offended by it, or like?
No, no, to all of it. I never watched them. I never read them. It wasn't
Really?
You didn't grow up with it, or you didn't?
Fantasy type of
Yeah.
stuff never really caught my attention. Yeah.
But after Mav talking about it, like,
It made me more curious. I was like, I can get down with that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's like I relate to that.
Yeah.
Well, I think at the end of the series, I think that in Harry Potter, because I grew up with him.
Yeah.
You know, almost quite literally, alongside. I think they make a point at the end of the book, you know, where Harry's. I don't want to, you know, spoilers, guys. I don't know what the statute is, limitation is on that.
Yeah.
But
It's 5 years.
he's speaking to his children. They're sending him off to Hogwarts for the first time, and he's scared that he's gonna get put into the wrong school, you know, because they associate it with, you know, the bad guys and all that. But in the end, he's just trying to say that, you know, it doesn't matter because, you know, some of my best friends were in this group and this group and that class, and they were some of the finest people he's ever met. Like, and he's named after like some of his people that protected him when he was a kid, and they were in these different houses. So it's kind of transcending that thing. But
yeah.
You know, again, Maverick kind of comes from his lens there, and which is great. Like you said, he's trying to connect with her, and I think that's pretty beautiful, actually.
Yeah. I think also, you know, for my recollection of it, I haven't seen the films, but I've seen the movies. I mean, I've read the novels. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. And you know, like they say, I'm assuming the novel is better. But from what I remember, didn't Harry become a cop essentially, like one of those Hogwarts cops or like school wizard cops or something? And it's kind of ironic
with the Ministry of Defense or you know, magic. Yeah. So also dorky talking about this, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, something like that. He becomes a cop.
Yeah.
An aura, I think they're called. I mean, I know.
Well, I'm just talking about it the way I understand it. You know, you got all the fancy language,
but he's a just one, okay? He's just.
Yeah, I always felt like Hermione gets so little credit for all she did, like saving his rear end so many times. And anyway, let's not get into a tangent. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us in our discussion on The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Join us on our next episode to continue the discussion. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspired you to pick up a copy. We are also now on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.
So please follow us and
pick up a book.
Pick up a book or two.
Or three.
Yeah. One for each Harry Potter house.
There you go. All right, guys. See you next time.
Right.
Peace. Bye.